The bitter wind howled across the barren Montana landscape like a hungry wolf, cutting through Josephine Jameson's threadbare coat as if it were made of paper instead of wool. She stumbled forward, her fingers numb and her lips turning blue, certain that death awaited her in this unforgiving winter of 1876. The stagecoach that had abandoned her after breaking an axle was now merely a dark speck on the horizon, the driver having promised to return with help, a promise Josephine knew might well be empty. "Just a little farther," she whispered to herself, her voice carried away by the relentless wind. Her valise, containing everything she owned in the world, grew heavier with each laborious step through the knee-deep snow. The sun was already dipping toward the jagged mountains to the west, and Josephine knew that without shelter, she wouldn't survive the night. The letter from her late aunt's lawyer had seemed like salvation just weeks ago, offering her ownership of a small plot of land in Montana Territory, an escape from the suffocating life as a seamstress in Philadelphia after her parents' passing. Now, that same letter seemed like a cruel joke as she faced the prospect of freezing to death before ever seeing the property. A gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and Josephine staggered, dropping to one knee in the snow. Tears froze on her cheeks as she contemplated her fate, 22 years old and about to die alone in a frozen wasteland. She'd been a fool to think she could make a new life for herself out west. Just as despair threatened to consume her, Josephine spotted a thin tendril of smoke rising above the tree line in the distance. Hope surged through her veins, giving her renewed strength to push forward. Where there was smoke, there was fire, and where there was fire, there might be salvation. Her feet had long since lost all feeling as she trudged toward the promise of warmth. The trees grew denser, providing some shelter from the wind, but the temperature continued to drop as twilight descended. Josephine's breathing grew labored, her lungs burning with each inhale of frigid air. The cabin appeared so suddenly that Josephine thought it might be a hallucination, a small, sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, from which the smoke curled upward into the darkening sky. Light glowed from a single window like a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. With the last of her strength, Josephine staggered to the door and raised her hand to knock. Before her frozen knuckles could make contact with the wood, her knees buckled and darkness enveloped her. The sensation of warmth was what brought Josephine back to consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered open to the soft orange glow of firelight dancing on log walls. She was lying on a narrow bed covered with thick furs, her sodden coat and boots removed, her damp hair loose around her shoulders. "You're awake." The deep voice startled her, and Josephine jerked upright, clutching the furs to her chest. A man sat in a chair by the fireplace, his features shadowed, but his posture alert. "I was starting to worry you might not come around." "Where am I?" Josephine's voice emerged as a croak, her throat parched. The man rose and moved to a small table, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup. As he approached, the firelight illuminated his face, strong-jawed, with several days' growth of beard, and eyes the color of a summer sky. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a flannel shirt with a leather vest, worn jeans, and scuffed boots. A cowboy by the look of him, though not the flashy kind depicted in the dime novels that had become so popular back east. "My cabin," he said, handing her the cup. "About 15 miles northeast of Whitefish Creek. I found you collapsed on my doorstep about 3 hours ago, half frozen and barely breathing." Josephine accepted the water with trembling hands. "Thank you, mister." Quincy Morgan." He returned to his chair, giving her space. "And you are?" "Josephine Jameson." She sipped the water, relishing the cool relief it brought to her parched throat. "I was on the stagecoach to Whitefish Creek when it broke down. The driver said he'd return with help, but—" "Jenkins abandoned you?" Quincy's voice hardened. That yellow-bellied snake. He should have known better than to leave anyone out in this weather. "He seemed in quite a hurry to reach town," Josephine said, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her situation. She was alone in a cabin with a strange man, wearing only her dress and petticoats. Yet, given the alternative of freezing to death, propriety seemed a minor concern. "Storm's getting worse," Quincy observed, moving to the window and pushing aside a rough burlap curtain. Outside, snow swirled in a frenzied dance, illuminated by the faint glow from the cabin. You're lucky you found my place. There's not another soul for miles. I'm imposing on your hospitality, Josephine said, making an effort to sit up straighter. If there's any way I can compensate you for your trouble. Quincy waved a dismissive hand. No trouble. I couldn't very well leave you to freeze, could I? He moved to the fire and added another log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Are you hungry? I've got some stew on the stove. As if in response, Josephine's stomach growled audibly. She blushed, but Quincy just chuckled and moved to the small iron stove in the corner of the cabin. He ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl and brought it to her with a spoon and a hunk of crusty bread. It's venison, he said. Not fancy, but it'll warm you up. The stew was hearty and flavorful, with chunks of meat, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. Josephine hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her lips. She ate with as much decorum as she could muster, though she wanted nothing more than to devour the meal in undignified haste. What brings you to this part of the territory, Miss Jameson? Quincy asked, returning to his chair. Not many young women travel alone out here. Between bites, Josephine explained about her aunt's bequest, a small cabin, and a few acres just outside of Whitefish Creek. It's not much according to the lawyer's letter, but it's something of my own. After my parents died of influenza last spring, there was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia. Quincy nodded, his expression thoughtful. Whitefish Creek's a decent enough town, though it has its share of rough elements. The mine brings in all sorts, some looking for honest work, others not so much. And you? Josephine asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Do you work at the mine? A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. No, madam. I've got a small spread a few miles from here. Nothing grand, just enough grazing land for my horses. I break and train them, sell them to the army sometimes, or to ranchers who need good stock. You live here alone? Just me and the horses. There was something in his voice that suggested a story, but he didn't elaborate. Josephine finished her stew, feeling strength return to her limbs along with the comforting warmth. The storm? How long do you think it will last? Quincy rose and checked the window again. Hard to say. These late winter blizzards can blow themselves out by morning or rage for days. He glanced back at her. I'm afraid you might be stuck with my company for a bit, Miss Jameson. The prospect wasn't as alarming as it should have been. There was something reassuring about Quincy Morgan, a quiet strength that made Josephine feel safe despite the precariousness of her situation. I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Morgan. Quincy, please, he said, taking her empty bowl. If we're to be snowbound together, we might as well dispense with formalities. Then you must call me Josephine, she replied, fighting a yawn that crept up unexpectedly. You should rest, Quincy said, noticing her fatigue. The bed's yours. I'll take the chair. Josephine wanted to protest, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Thank you, Quincy. As she settled back against the pillow, pulling the furs up to her chin, Josephine watched Quincy move about the cabin, banking the fire for the night. There was an easy grace to his movements, a confidence that spoke of a man at home in his own skin and in this harsh wilderness. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was Quincy adding another log to the fire, his silhouette outlined by the warm glow, solid and reassuring against the howling chaos of the storm outside. Morning arrived with a stillness that spoke of the storm's passing. Josephine woke to the gentle crackling of the fire and the aroma of coffee brewing. She blinked in the soft light filtering through the cabin's small windows, momentarily disoriented before remembering the events of the previous day. Quincy was already up, standing by the stove with his back to her. He wore a clean shirt, his hair damp, as if he'd recently washed it. Sensing her gaze, he turned, a smile creasing the corners of his eyes. Good morning, he said. Coffee? Josephine sat up, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. Her hair hung in tangles around her shoulders, and her dress was hopelessly wrinkled. Yes, please. Thank you. He brought her a steaming cup, then gestured to a basin of water on a small table. If you'd like to freshen up, I've heated some water. There's a comb there, too. Grateful for his consideration, Josephine waited until he stepped outside before rising from the bed. Her limbs were stiff and sore from her ordeal, but the danger of frostbite seemed to have passed. She washed her face and hands in the basin, combed the tangles from her hair, and did her best to smooth the wrinkles from her dress. When Quincy returned, stamping snow from his boots, she felt more presentable, her hair braided and pinned up as neatly as she could manage without her usual toiletries. "The storm's passed," he reported, "but it's left nearly 3 feet of snow. The trail to town will be impassable for a few days, I'm afraid." Josephine's heart sank. "I'm imposing on you terribly." Quincy shook his head, his expression sincere. "Not at all. I'm glad for the company, truth be told. Gets lonely out here, especially in winter." They shared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with dried berries and crisp bacon. Afterward, Quincy pulled on his heavy coat and hat. "I need to check on the horses," he explained. "They're in a sheltered paddock with a lean-to, but I want to make sure they've got water and feed." "May I come with you?" Josephine asked impulsively. After the close confinement of the stagecoach and now the cabin, she longed for fresh air, despite the cold. Quincy looked surprised, but nodded. "Bundle up. I've got an extra coat and some boots that might fit you." The coat was enormous on her frame, the sleeves hanging well past her fingertips, but it was warm. The boots, stuffed with extra socks, were manageable. Thus outfitted, Josephine followed Quincy into the bright, snow-covered world outside. The transformation was breathtaking. What had been a threatening wilderness in the storm now sparkled like a sea of diamonds under the clear blue sky. Snow blanketed everything: the trees, the distant mountains, and the rolling meadow behind Quincy's cabin. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, her exhalation forming a cloud in the frigid air. "That it is," Quincy agreed, but when she glanced at him, he was looking at her, not the landscape. The horses were in a sturdy corral about 50 yards from the cabin. 6 of them, in varying shades of brown and black, nickered softly as Quincy approached. He greeted each by name, checking their water trough and distributing hay from a nearby stack protected by a lean-to. "This is Thunderhead," he said, as a magnificent black stallion approached the fence. "My best stud. And that's Maple, Starlight, Rusty, Wind Dancer, and the little mare with the white blaze is Whisper." The horses were clearly well cared for, their coats gleaming despite the winter weather. Josephine reached out tentatively to Whisper, who snuffled at her hand with velvety lips. "She likes you," Quincy observed, a note of approval in his voice. "They're beautiful animals," Josephine said. "You must be very good at what you do." "I get by," he replied modestly, but his eyes shone with pride as he surveyed his small herd. "My father taught me everything I know about horses. He had a way with them that was almost magical." "Is your father—" "Passed on 5 years back," Quincy said, his expression sobering. "Spanish influenza took both my parents within a week of each other." "I'm sorry," Josephine said softly, the shared grief creating an unexpected bond between them. "That's how I lost my parents, too." Quincy nodded in understanding, no words needed for the mutual recognition of loss. They spent the morning tending to the horses and clearing paths through the snow, from the cabin to the corral and woodpile. Despite her city upbringing, Josephine insisted on helping, and Quincy showed her how to use a shovel effectively, his hands occasionally covering hers to demonstrate the proper grip. Each time they touched, even through gloves, Josephine felt a curious warmth that had nothing to do with exertion. There was something about this quiet, capable man that drew her to him, a steadiness she had never encountered before. By midday, they were both rosy-cheeked from the cold and ready for the warmth of the cabin. Quincy prepared a lunch of beans and the last of the bacon, which they ate at the small table by the window. Outside, the sun gleamed on the pristine snow, creating a landscape that seemed almost too perfect to be real. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Quincy said as they finished eating. "I've never been east of the Mississippi." Josephine described the busy streets, the grand buildings, the theaters and shops. But as she spoke, she realized how little she missed it all. There had been a hollowness to her life there, especially after her parents' deaths, a sense of going through motions without purpose. "It sounds very different from here," Quincy observed when she fell silent. "It is," Josephine agreed, looking out at the vast, open landscape. "But I think I might prefer this. There's an honesty to it, a directness. In Philadelphia, everything feels layered with pretense. Quincy's eyes crinkled at the corners. Most folks who come from cities can't wait to get back to them. They find the silence out here unnerving. I find it peaceful, Josephine said, though I imagine it gets lonely. It does, Quincy admitted. That's why I come into town every few weeks, trade for supplies, maybe have a drink at the saloon, hear some news. But I'm always glad to get back to my own place. Have you always lived alone? The question slipped out before Josephine could consider its propriety. Quincy's expression grew guarded. Not always. I was married once, briefly. The revelation surprised Josephine, though she wasn't sure why it should. A man like Quincy, handsome, capable, kind, would naturally have attracted female attention. What happened? She asked softly, then shook her head. Forgive me, that's much too personal a question. No, it's all right. Quincy was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Her name was Sarah. We met when I delivered some horses to her father's ranch. She was beautiful. Spirited, said she loved the freedom of the West. His voice grew distant with memory. We married quickly, maybe too quickly. 6 months later, she told me she couldn't stand the isolation, the hard work, the endless spaces. She left on the next stagecoach east and never returned. The pain in his voice was old, but still palpable. Josephine's heart ached for him. I'm sorry. Quincy shrugged, his expression clearing. It was 5 years ago. I've made my peace with it. He glanced at her, curiosity in his eyes. What about you? No husband waiting back in Philadelphia? Josephine shook her head. No, there was a man my parents hoped I would marry, the son of my father's business partner. Richard was suitable. She wrinkled her nose at the word. But there was never any spark between us, no real connection. After my parents died, he made his offer, but I couldn't accept. It wouldn't have been fair to either of us. So you chose to start fresh in Montana instead? It seemed like fate when my aunt's letter arrived, Josephine said. A chance to build something that was entirely my own. Quincy studied her for a long moment. It takes courage to make that kind of journey alone. Or foolishness, Josephine said wryly, thinking of how close she'd come to freezing to death. Sometimes they're not so different, Quincy replied with a small smile. The line between bravery and foolhardiness is often mighty thin out here. As the afternoon waned, Quincy taught Josephine how to play checkers with a hand-carved set his father had made. They sat by the fire, the game between them, conversation flowing easily from childhood memories to books they had read to hopes for the future. Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in months. There was an ease to Quincy's company that made her forget the strangeness of their situation, a single woman stranded with a man she barely knew, cut off from civilization by miles of snow. Yet, she felt safer with him than she had anywhere since her parents' home. As darkness fell, Quincy prepared a dinner of venison steaks and potatoes, insisting that Josephine rest while he cooked. She watched him move about the small kitchen area with practiced efficiency, his strong hands deftly slicing and seasoning. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked. "Necessity," he replied with a grin. "It was either learn or eat raw meat and uncooked beans. My mother taught me the basics before I left home, and I've picked up a few tricks over the years." The meal was delicious, the venison tender and flavorful. They ate by lamplight, the fire crackling companionably in the background. "How long have you lived here?" Josephine asked, savoring her last bite. "Built this place about 7 years ago," Quincy said, gesturing around the cabin. "Started with just the main room, added the lean-to for storage later. It's not much, but it serves." "I think it's wonderful," Josephine said sincerely. "It feels like a home." Quincy looked pleased at her assessment. "That's kind of you to say." After dinner, they washed the dishes together, Josephine insisting on helping, despite Quincy's protests that she was his guest. Their hands brushed in the warm water, and Josephine felt that now familiar flutter in her chest, a sensation she'd never experienced before meeting this quiet cowboy. Later, as they sat by the fire, Quincy playing a harmonica with surprising skill, Josephine found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheeks in the firelight. He was not conventionally handsome like the polished gentlemen of Philadelphia, but there was a magnetism to him that drew her gaze again and again. When he caught her looking, Josephine blushed and quickly averted her eyes, embarrassed to be caught staring. But when she chanced to glance back at him, Quincy was still watching her, a warmth in his gaze that made her heart skip a beat. "It's getting late," he said finally, tucking the harmonica into his pocket. "You should take the bed again." "I can't displace you for another night," Josephine protested. "I'll sleep by the fire." "Absolutely not," Quincy said firmly. "My mother would turn in her grave if she knew I let a lady sleep on the floor while I took the bed." Their compromise was to share the small space, Quincy making a pallet of blankets on the floor beside the bed, close enough to the fire to stay warm, but maintaining a respectful distance from Josephine. As she lay in the darkness, listening to Quincy's steady breathing, Josephine realized she was in danger of developing feelings for this man she had known for barely more than a day. It was foolish, impractical, possibly even improper, and yet, in the quiet of the night, with the vast Montana wilderness surrounding them, conventional wisdom seemed very far away. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Josephine woke to find Quincy already outside, the sound of an axe splitting wood carrying through the crisp air. She dressed quickly and stepped out to find him by the woodpile, his breath forming clouds as he swung the axe in powerful, practiced strokes. He'd removed his coat despite the cold, and his shirt clung to his broad shoulders, damp with exertion. Josephine paused at the sight, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Quincy spotted her and lowered the axe, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Josephine replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at his smile. "Is there anything I can help with?" "I'm just about finished here," he said, setting the last log on the chopping block. "But if you're offering, I wouldn't mind some coffee." Inside, Josephine stoked the fire and put the coffee pot on the stove. There was a comfortable domesticity to the task that she found surprisingly satisfying. By the time Quincy came in, stamping snow from his boots, she had coffee brewing and was slicing bread for breakfast. "Smells good," he said appreciatively, hanging his coat by the door. They ate breakfast companionably, discussing the weather and Quincy's plans for the day. He needed to check on a fence line that might have been damaged by the storm, and Josephine immediately volunteered to accompany him. "It's rough terrain," Quincy warned, "and still mighty cold." "I'm stronger than I look," Josephine assured him. After 2 days of rest and good food, she felt revitalized, eager to prove herself useful. Quincy studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, bundle up warm." They set out after breakfast, Quincy on his sturdy gelding, Rusty and Josephine on the gentle mare, Whisper. Quincy had been concerned about Josephine's riding abilities, but she surprised him by mounting with ease and settling comfortably into the saddle. "My father insisted I learn to ride properly," she explained, adjusting her borrowed gloves. "He believed every lady should know how to handle a horse, though in Philadelphia we rarely rode anywhere but the park. The snow made for slow going, but the horses were sure-footed, picking their way carefully along the trail Quincy knew by heart. The landscape opened up around them, rolling hills covered in snow, stands of pine and aspen, and in the distance, the jagged peaks of mountains against the brilliant blue sky. "It's breathtaking," Josephine said, her eyes wide as she took in the vastness of it all. "That it is," Quincy agreed, his gaze traveling from the horizon to her face. "This country gets in your blood. I can't imagine living anywhere else now." They reached the fence line around midday. As Quincy had suspected, a section had been damaged by the weight of the snow, and they spent the next hour repairing it, Josephine holding tools and wire as Quincy worked. Despite the cold, she enjoyed the physical labor, the sense of accomplishment as the fence took shape again under Quincy's skilled hands. "You're a natural out here," Quincy observed as they mounted up to head back to the cabin. "Most city folks would be complaining by now about the cold or the work." "I like feeling useful," Josephine admitted. "In Philadelphia, after my parents died, I felt decorative, like an ornament with no purpose beyond looking proper at the right functions." Quincy nodded in understanding. "Out here, everyone has a purpose, work that matters. It's one of the things I love about this life. On their return journey, they took a different route, Quincy pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. As they crested a small rise, he reined in his horse, gesturing for Josephine to look to the west. "That's Whitefish Creek down there," he said, pointing to a distant cluster of buildings nestled in a valley. "And just beyond it, that small plateau with the stand of pines that might be your aunt's property." Josephine gazed at the distant landscape, trying to imagine her new home. From here, it looked peaceful, promising a fresh start in a land of possibility. "How long do you think it will be before the trail to town is passable?" Quincy squinted at the sky, considering. "Weather holds, maybe another day or two. The sun's doing good work on the snow." Josephine felt a curious mix of anticipation and regret at the thought of leaving Quincy's cabin. She was eager to see her inheritance, to begin building her new life, but the prospect of saying goodbye to Quincy brought an unexpected pang. "Will you, that is, perhaps you might show me the way to town when the trail clears?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'd be glad to," Quincy replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. Planned to offer, in fact. The ride back to the cabin seemed shorter, filled with easy conversation and shared observations. By the time they reached the corral, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the snow. After tending to the horses, they returned to the cabin, both pleasantly tired from the day's exertions. Quincy built up the fire, while Josephine prepared a simple supper from their dwindling supplies. "We'll need to get to town soon for provisions," Quincy said as they ate. "I'm running low on just about everything." "I've imposed on your generosity for too long," Josephine said, guilt pricking at her. "Not at all," Quincy assured her. "Truth is, these have been the most pleasant days I've spent in a long while." His candor surprised and pleased her. "For me as well," Josephine admitted softly. "Despite the circumstances that brought me here." Their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passing between them. Quincy cleared his throat and looked away first, rising to collect their plates. "I found some playing cards this morning," he said, his tone deliberately lighter. "Thought we might pass the evening with a game of rummy, if you're familiar with it." Josephine welcomed the diversion, conscious of the growing tension between them, not an unpleasant tension, but one that left her feeling both exhilarated and uncertain. They played cards by the light of the oil lamp, the fire crackling in the background. Quincy proved to be a skilled player, but Josephine held her own, winning nearly as many hands as she lost. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and good-natured teasing. As the evening wore on, the cabin grew colder despite the fire. Josephine tried to suppress a shiver, but Quincy noticed immediately. "The temperature's dropping," he observed, setting down his cards and moving to the window. Outside, the clear sky was ablaze with stars, a beautiful but ominous sign of a frigid night ahead. "I'll build up the fire." He added several logs, stoking the flames until they roared up the chimney. Then, to Josephine's surprise, he took a fur from the bed and draped it gently around her shoulders. "Better?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "Yes, thank you," Josephine replied, suddenly aware of how close he stood, the scent of pine and leather that clung to him, the warmth of his hands as they lingered briefly on her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, as if giving her every chance to pull away, Quincy reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her cheek in a touch so gentle it might have been imagined. "Josephine," he said, her name almost a question on his lips. The moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the cabin windows. Quincy stepped back, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "It's late," he said. "We should get some rest." That night, as Josephine lay awake listening to the wind howl outside and Quincy's steady breathing from his pallet on the floor, she acknowledged to herself what she had been trying to deny. She was falling in love with this quiet, honorable cowboy who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. What did she really know about Quincy Morgan beyond these few days of shared isolation? And what could possibly come of such feelings? Soon she would be in Whitefish Creek, establishing herself on her aunt's property, while Quincy would return to his solitary life with his horses. Yet, as she finally drifted off to sleep, Josephine couldn't help but wonder if there might be a future where their paths continued to intertwine. Morning brought a subtle change in the weather, a softening of the air that suggested a thaw. After breakfast, Quincy announced that he needed to check the trail to town. "If it's clearing, we might be able to make the journey tomorrow," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll come with you," Josephine said, already reaching for her borrowed boots. They rode out under a pale blue sky, the sun warm on their faces despite the chill in the air. The snow had indeed begun to melt in places, creating treacherous patches of slush that the horses navigated carefully. About 3 miles from the cabin, they came upon the main trail to Whitefish Creek. Here the going was easier, the path somewhat cleared by the passage of the sun across the southern exposure. "Another day like this, and the trail will be passable," Quincy said, surveying the terrain. "We could likely make it to town by tomorrow afternoon." Josephine nodded, trying to summon enthusiasm for what should have been welcome news. Instead, she felt a hollow ache at the thought of leaving the cozy cabin and Quincy's steady presence. "That's good," she said finally, her voice lacking conviction. Quincy glanced at her, something flickering in his eyes that might have been disappointment or merely reflection. "Yes, I suppose it is." They turned their horses back toward the cabin in silent agreement, the easy camaraderie of the morning somehow diminished. As they rode side by side, Josephine searched for words to express the tangle of emotions within her, but nothing seemed adequate. It was Quincy who finally broke the silence as they approached a small frozen stream. "Your aunt's property," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do you know what's on it? A house or land for building?" "The lawyer's letter mentioned a cabin," Josephine replied, grateful for the safe topic. "Small but sound," he said, "with a garden plot and access to water. Beyond that, I know very little." "Whitefish Creek is growing," Quincy observed. "The mine brings new folks in regularly. If your property is well situated, it could be valuable." "I hadn't thought of it that way," Josephine admitted. "I was just grateful for a place to call my own." Quincy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's good land around there. You could do well for yourself." There was something in his tone that Josephine couldn't quite decipher, a restraint, perhaps, or a careful distance. Before she could pursue it, a movement in the trees to their right caught her attention. "Quincy," she said, pointing. "What's that?" He followed her gaze, then reined in his horse sharply. "Wolves," he said in a low voice. "Stay close to me." Josephine's heart began to pound as she saw them, 3 gray shapes moving through the trees, their yellow eyes fixed on the horses. Whisper snorted nervously beneath her, sensing the predators. "Easy, girl," Josephine murmured, patting the mare's neck while keeping her eyes on the wolves. "What do we do?" "We back away slowly," Quincy said, his voice steady, though his hand had moved to the rifle in his saddle holster. "They probably won't attack 2 mounted riders unless they're desperate, but hunger makes for bold predators." They began to retreat, keeping the horses at a walk despite their obvious nervousness. The wolves paced alongside them in the trees, watching with calculating eyes. "They're following us," Josephine whispered, fear making her voice tremble. "Just keep moving," Quincy instructed. "Steady now." One of the wolves, larger than the others, darted forward suddenly, snapping at Whisper's legs. The mare reared in panic, and Josephine, caught off guard, lost her grip on the reins. She felt herself sliding backward, a scream tearing from her throat as she fell. She hit the snow hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Through a haze of pain, she saw Quincy dismount in one fluid motion, the rifle in his hands. A shot cracked the air, then another. The wolves scattered, disappearing into the trees with startled yelps. "Josephine!" Quincy was kneeling beside her in an instant, his face tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" She tried to speak, but could only gasp for breath, the fall having winded her completely. Quincy's arm slid beneath her shoulders, supporting her as she struggled to inhale. "Easy," he murmured. "Just breathe. Nice and slow." Gradually, the burning in her lungs eased, and Josephine managed a shaky breath. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice was weak. "Just startled." Quincy helped her to sit up, his hands gentle but firm. "Are you sure? Nothing broken?" Josephine took stock of her body, wincing as she moved her right ankle. "My ankle, I think I twisted it when I fell." Quincy carefully examined her ankle through her boot. his touch causing Josephine to inhale sharply, partly from pain, partly from the intimacy of his ministrations. "It's swelling," he confirmed. "We need to get you back to the cabin." With exquisite care, he helped Josephine to her feet, supporting her weight when she couldn't put pressure on her injured ankle. The horses had calmed somewhat, though Whisper still showed the whites of her eyes, nostrils flaring at the lingering scent of wolf. "Can you ride?" Quincy asked, concern etched in his features. "I think so," Josephine said, determined not to be a burden. "If you'll help me up." With Quincy's assistance, she managed to mount Whisper, though the process sent shards of pain through her ankle. Quincy kept a hand on her reins as they made their way slowly back to the cabin, his vigilant gaze scanning the trees for any sign of the wolves' return. By the time they reached the cabin, Josephine's ankle had swollen considerably, and the pain had intensified to a persistent throb. Quincy lifted her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing, carrying her into the cabin and setting her gently on the bed. "I need to see to the horses," he said, his brow furrowed with worry. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Josephine nodded, fighting back tears of pain and frustration. What a fool she must seem to him, helpless not once but twice now, unable even to stay on a horse properly. While Quincy tended to the horses, she removed her boot with painstaking care, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her ankle. The joint was already discolored, purple bruising spreading beneath the skin. When Quincy returned, his expression darkened at the sight of her injury. "That looks painful." "It's not so bad," Josephine lied, attempting a brave smile that faltered as Quincy gently probed the swollen flesh. "It's not broken, I don't think," he said after a careful examination. "But it's a nasty sprain. You won't be walking on it for a few days at least." Josephine's heart sank. "But the trail to town—" "We'll have to wait," Quincy said firmly. "You're not going anywhere on that ankle." He moved to the cupboard and returned with a small bottle and some clean cloth. "Witch hazel," he explained, pouring some of the liquid onto the cloth. "It helps with swelling." The cooling sensation of the witch hazel brought immediate relief as Quincy wrapped her ankle in the damp cloth, his big hands surprisingly deft. "You seem to know what you're doing," Josephine observed, trying to distract herself from both the pain and the unsettling awareness of his touch. "Had my share of sprains working with horses," Quincy replied with a small smile. "And my mother was something of a healer, knew all manner of remedies for cuts, bruises, breaks, and burns. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Quincy agreed, a softness entering his voice. "Would have liked you, I think. She always said you could judge a person by how they handled adversity." "And how am I doing by that measure?" Josephine asked, attempting levity despite her discomfort. Quincy finished wrapping her ankle and looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "Better than most men I know, let alone women raised in city comfort." The compliment warmed Josephine more than she cared to admit. "Thank you for taking care of me. Again." "It's no hardship," Quincy said simply, rising to stoke the fire. The rest of the day passed in a blur of pain and drowsiness, as Josephine's body responded to the trauma of the fall. Quincy prepared a tea with willow bark that he said would help with the pain, and it did seem to dull the worst of the throbbing. He brought her books from his small collection to pass the time, checked her ankle periodically, and ensured she was comfortable. As evening approached, Josephine found herself watching Quincy as he moved about the cabin, appreciating anew the quiet competence with which he handled every task. There was nothing showy about him, nothing that sought attention or praise. He simply did what needed doing, with a sure-handedness that spoke of a life lived by his own standards. "You're staring," Quincy observed mildly, glancing up from the stew he was stirring. Josephine blushed, caught. "I was just thinking how different you are from the men I knew in Philadelphia." "Different good or different bad?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Different good," Josephine assured him. "Very good." Something shifted in Quincy's expression, a warming in his eyes that made Josephine's pulse quicken, but he merely nodded and returned his attention to the stew, leaving her to wonder what he might have said if he'd spoken his thoughts aloud. They ate dinner together, Josephine propped up in the bed with her injured ankle elevated on a folded blanket. The stew was hearty and warming, perfect for the chill that had returned as the sun set. "The wolves," Josephine said suddenly, remembering. Were they after us, or just the horses? Hungry wolves will go after anything they think they can take down, Quincy replied. This time of year, game is scarce, and they get desperate. You shot at them, Josephine recalled. Did you? Hit one, I think, Quincy said, his expression somber. Didn't kill it, just scared them off. I don't like killing predators unless there's no choice, they're just doing what nature designed them to do. But I couldn't let them get to you. The matter-of-fact way he stated his willingness to protect her sent a warmth through Josephine that had nothing to do with the fire or the stew. As the evening wore on, Josephine's eyelids grew heavy, the combination of pain, willow bark tea, and the day's excitement taking its toll. She fought against sleep, reluctant to end this time with Quincy, aware that each day that passed brought them closer to parting ways. You should rest, Quincy said, noticing her struggle to stay awake. Sleep is the best medicine for injuries. Will you sit with me for a while? Josephine asked, the request slipping out before she could consider its propriety. If Quincy found the appeal strange, he gave no sign of it. He simply pulled his chair closer to the bed and sat, his presence solid and reassuring in the flickering firelight. Tell me about your horses, Josephine said softly, seeking the comfort of his voice. How did you come to train them? Quincy began to speak, his deep voice washing over her like a balm. He told her about his first horse, a stubborn pinto he'd named Troublemaker, about learning to gentle wild mustangs from his father, about the satisfaction of seeing a horse respond to patience and kindness rather than force. Josephine drifted off to the sound of his voice, a smile curving her lips as sleep claimed her. She awoke in the middle of the night to find the cabin dark, except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure what had roused her. Then a movement beside the bed caught her attention. Quincy was still in the chair, his head tilted back, fast asleep. He must have nodded off while sitting with her, unwilling to leave her alone with her injury. The realization brought a lump to Josephine's throat. In the soft glow from the embers, his face was relaxed, the lines of care smoothed away. He looked younger, vulnerable somehow, and Josephine felt a surge of tenderness so powerful it was almost painful. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. Quincy stirred at the contact, his eyes opening slowly to find hers in the darkness. You should be in your own bed, Josephine whispered, not sleeping in a chair. Wanted to be sure you were all right, Quincy replied, his voice husky with sleep. I'm fine, she assured him. Thanks to you. Quincy covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Get some rest, Josephine. But neither of them moved, their hands remaining joined in the darkness, a silent acknowledgement of something growing between them that neither had yet found the words to express. Finally, reluctantly, Quincy withdrew his hand and rose from the chair. Call if you need anything, he said, moving to his pallet by the fire. Josephine watched him go, already missing his touch, his presence. Good night, Quincy, she whispered. Good night, Josephine, came his soft reply from the darkness. Over the next 2 days, Josephine's ankle improved steadily under Quincy's attentive care. The swelling subsided, and the pain diminished to a dull ache that was manageable without the willow bark tea. By the 3rd morning, she was able to put weight on it, albeit gingerly. Look at you, Quincy said with approval, as she took tentative steps across the cabin, one hand on the table for support. You'll be dancing a jig in no time. Hardly that, Josephine laughed, but at least I won't be a complete invalid when we reach Whitefish Creek. The mention of town brought a shadow across Quincy's face, there and gone so quickly Josephine might have imagined it. The trail should be clear enough by tomorrow, he said, his tone carefully neutral, if you're feeling up to it. Yes, Josephine said, though the prospect of leaving the cabin and Quincy filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. I should see my property, make arrangements for supplies. Quincy nodded, turning to stir the porridge cooking on the stove. I'll need to stock up as well. We can ride together, if that suits you. I'd like that, Josephine said softly. They spent the day in companionable activity, Josephine insisting on helping with small tasks despite her lingering limp. She darned a tear in one of Quincy's shirts while he repaired a bridle, their conversation flowing easily from practical matters to shared stories of their pasts. As evening approached, a curious tension settled over the cabin, a sense of something ending before it had truly begun. Josephine felt it in the careful way Quincy avoided her gaze at times, in the slight hesitation before he spoke, in the distance he maintained between them. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Josephine finally gathered her courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Quincy," she began, her heart pounding, "I want to thank you properly for all you've done for me." He looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling, his expression guarded. "There's no need for thanks." "Yes, there is," Josephine insisted. "You saved my life, cared for me when I was injured, shared your food and your home with a complete stranger. I don't know what would have become of me without you." "Anyone would have done the same," Quincy said, his modesty so typical of him that Josephine couldn't help but smile. "No, they wouldn't," she contradicted gently. "What you've done goes beyond common decency or obligation. And I want you to know that these days with you have meant more to me than I can express." Quincy's hands stilled, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Josephine, please, let me finish," she said quickly, afraid that if she didn't speak now, she never would. "I know we've known each other only a short time, and perhaps it's foolish of me, but I've come to care for you, Quincy, more than I thought possible." The confession hung in the air between them, Josephine's heart in her throat as she waited for his response. Quincy set aside his whittling and stood, moving to the window to gaze out at the night, his back to her. "You don't even know me," he said finally, his voice rough. "A few days in a cabin doesn't reveal a person's true nature." "I know enough," Josephine replied, rising from her chair despite the twinge in her ankle. "I know you're kind and honorable, patient and skilled with your hands. I know you love this land and your horses, that you miss your parents but have made peace with their passing. I know you were hurt once by someone who couldn't appreciate the life you've built here." She took a step toward him, then another, until she stood just behind him. "And I know that when I'm with you, I feel more alive, more myself than I ever have before." Slowly Quincy turned to face her, his expression a complex mixture of longing and restraint. "And what about your plans? Your aunt's property, the new life you came here to build?" "Plans can change," Josephine said simply. "Dreams can be reshaped." Quincy shook his head, though his eyes never left hers. "I have nothing to offer you, Josephine. A small cabin, a hard life miles from town and civilization. You deserve more than that." "Shouldn't I be the judge of what I deserve?" Josephine countered, taking another step closer. "Of what would make me happy." "And what would make you happy?" Quincy asked, so quietly she had to strain to hear him. Josephine took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. "A chance to see if what I feel for you could grow into something lasting. A chance to build a life together, if that's what we both want." For a long moment, Quincy simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand in his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I've been alone a long time," he said, his voice low. "Got used to it, even convinced myself I preferred it that way. But these past days with you—" He paused, searching for words. "You've brought something into this cabin I didn't know was missing. Light, laughter, a kind of joy I'd forgotten existed." Hope bloomed in Josephine's chest, warming her from within. "Quincy, I care for you too, Josephine," he continued, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "More than is wise, perhaps, given how brief our acquaintance has been. But I can't deny what I feel." Josephine's heart soared at his words, but Quincy wasn't finished. "Still," he said, a note of caution entering his voice, "feelings born in isolation, in unusual circumstances like these, can be misleading. They can seem stronger, more certain than they truly are." "What are you saying?" Josephine asked, a flicker of fear dampening her joy. Quincy's expression softened, his free hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "I'm saying we should proceed carefully. You should see your property, settle in Whitefish Creek. Give yourself time to be sure this is what you want. And I need to be certain I can be the man you deserve." It wasn't the passionate declaration Josephine had hoped for, but there was a wisdom in his words that she couldn't deny. Her impulsive nature had led her to speak her heart, but Quincy's measured response reflected a depth of character that only increased her admiration for him. "You're right," she acknowledged. "We should be sure." Relief flickered across Quincy's features, followed by something warmer, more intimate. "That doesn't mean I don't want to kiss you right now," he admitted, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. Josephine's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening at his words. "I wouldn't object if you did." For a heartbeat, Quincy hesitated, searching her eyes as if seeking final confirmation. Then, with exquisite gentleness, he bent and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a whisper of contact that sent shivers down Josephine's spine. Then, as she responded, it deepened, becoming something more urgent, more revealing. Quincy's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while Josephine's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself, as the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. When they finally parted, both were breathless, gazing at each other with a mixture of wonder and newfound understanding. "Well," Quincy said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "that seems promising." Josephine laughed softly, joy bubbling up within her. "Very promising." Quincy tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. "We'll take it a day at a time," he said. "See where the trail leads us." "I'd like that," Josephine replied, her heart full. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the night still and clear, the stars brilliant in the vast Montana sky. Inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, two people who had begun as strangers found themselves at the threshold of something new and hopeful, a journey neither had anticipated, but both now embraced. The journey to Whitefish Creek took most of the following day, the trail still challenging in places despite the thaw. Josephine rode Whisper, her ankle much improved but still tender, while Quincy led the way on Rusty. They traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and to share the lunch. Quincy had packed jerky, hardtack, and dried apples, simple fare that tasted like a feast in the crisp mountain air. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed, the wilderness giving way to scattered homesteads and eventually to cleared land surrounding the town itself. Whitefish Creek nestled in a valley beside the creek for which it was named, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a main street, with smaller dwellings spreading out toward the surrounding hills. "It's larger than I expected," Josephine observed as they approached, taking in the bustling activity wagons moving along the street, people going about their business, smoke rising from numerous chimneys. "Grown considerably since the mine opened," Quincy explained. "Not exactly a metropolis, but it serves the needs of her folks around these parts." They drew curious glances as they rode into town, Josephine acutely aware of her borrowed men's clothing and disheveled appearance after days in the wilderness. Quincy seemed oblivious to the attention, guiding them toward a 2-story building with a painted sign proclaiming it the Whitefish Creek Hotel and Dining Room. "Best place for you to stay while you get your bearings," he said, dismounting and coming to help Josephine down from Whisper. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, their eyes meeting briefly before he turned to secure the horses to the hitching post. Inside, the hotel lobby was simply furnished but clean, with a polished wooden counter behind which stood a thin woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun. She looked up as they entered, her eyebrows rising at Josephine's attire. "Mrs. Hollister," Quincy greeted her, removing his hat. "This is Miss Josephine Jameson. She's in need of a room for a few days." Mrs. Hollister's expression softened slightly at Quincy's polite introduction. "Morgan," she acknowledged. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." Her gaze shifted to Josephine, assessing. "Miss Jameson, is it?" "Yes, madam," Josephine replied, stepping forward. "I've just arrived to claim some property left to me by my aunt, Elizabeth Jameson." Recognition flickered across Mrs. Hollister's face. "Lizzie Jameson's niece? Well, that explains it." At Josephine's questioning look, she elaborated. "Your aunt was known for being unconventional, rode astride, wore trousers when it suited her, spoke her mind regardless of who was listening, caused quite a stir when she first arrived. But folks came to respect her." Josephine felt a rush of affection for the aunt she'd never known. "I'm afraid I didn't have the pleasure of knowing her well. She and my father had a falling out years ago." "That sounds like Lizzie," Mrs. Hollister said, with a dry chuckle. "Stubborn as they come." She pulled a ledger toward her and opened it. Now, how long will you be needing a room, Miss Jameson? I'm not certain, Josephine admitted, until I've had a chance to assess my aunt's property and make arrangements. The cabin's been empty since Lizzie passed, Mrs. Hollister informed her, though Tom Wheeler's been keeping an eye on it, making sure no squatters move in. He's the lawyer who handled her affairs. Yes, Mr. Wheeler is the one who wrote to me, Josephine confirmed. I'd like to see him as soon as possible. His office is just down the street, Mrs. Hollister said, turning the ledger for Josephine to sign. I'll put you in room 3 at the back, quieter there, away from the street noise. As Josephine signed the register, Mrs. Hollister's gaze shifted to Quincy, who stood a respectful distance away, hat in hand. And will you be needing a room as well, Morgan? No, madam, Quincy replied. I'll be heading back to my place once I've seen to some business in town. A flicker of disappointment passed through Josephine at his words, though she knew it was unreasonable to expect him to remain in town. He had his horses to tend to, his own life to return to. Well, you're welcome to use the bathhouse out back before you leave, Mrs. Hollister told them both. And Miss Jameson, I'll have some hot water sent up to your room. You look like you could use a proper wash. Thank you, Josephine said, grateful for the woman's matter-of-fact kindness. That would be wonderful. Mrs. Hollister handed her a key. Dining rooms open for supper from 5 to 8. Nothing fancy, but it's good, solid cooking. Quincy stepped forward then, placing some coins on the counter. For Miss Jameson's room and board, he said quietly. Quincy, no, Josephine protested. You've already done too much. I can pay my own way. Consider it a loan, he said, his expression brooking no argument. You can settle up with me once you've had a chance to get your affairs in order. Josephine wanted to insist, but something in Quincy's manner stopped her. His pride was involved somehow. His need to see her safely settled before he considered his duty discharged. So she merely nodded, murmuring, Thank you. I'll repay you as soon as I can. Mrs. Hollister, observing their exchange with barely concealed interest, collected the money and handed Quincy a receipt. Room 3 is up the stairs, first door on the right, she told Josephine. There's a washstand and pitcher, and I'll have Sally bring up some hot water shortly. Quincy carried Josephine's valise upstairs for her, pausing at the door to her room. I need to see about some supplies, and I should let the sheriff know about those wolves, he said, but I'll come back before I head out if that's all right. Of course, Josephine replied, suddenly aware that their time together was drawing to a close, at least for now. I'd like that. Alone in the small but tidy room, Josephine sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the abrupt transition from the intimate seclusion of Quincy's cabin to the relative bustle of the town. The room felt strange after days in Quincy's company, too quiet without his steady presence, too confining after the vastness of the wilderness. A knock at the door announced the arrival of hot water, carried by a young woman who introduced herself as Sally, Mrs. Hollister's daughter. She helped Josephine wash her hair and provided a clean dress from the hotel's collection of emergency garments, kept for travelers whose luggage had been lost or damaged. It's not fancy, Sally apologized, holding up a simple blue calico dress. But it's clean and should fit well enough until you can get your own things. It's perfect, Josephine assured her, grateful to exchange Quincy's oversized clothing for something more suitable. Thank you. Once dressed and with her hair neatly braided, Josephine felt more herself again. She was examining her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand when another knock came at the door. Quincy stood in the hallway, his own appearance transformed by a visit to the bathhouse. He'd shaved his beard, leaving only a neat mustache, and his hair was damp and combed back from his forehead. He'd changed into a clean shirt and vest, with a string tie at his collar. You look, Josephine began, momentarily at a loss for words. Civilized? Quincy suggested with a wry smile. Barely recognize myself. Handsome, Josephine corrected softly, though I was growing fond of the beard. A faint color rose in Quincy's cheeks, a rare sign of self-consciousness. Thought I should make myself presentable before heading back to town. Wouldn't want folks thinking I'm completely wild. His eyes traveled over her, taking in the borrowed dress and neatly braided hair. You look lovely. It was Josephine's turn to blush. Thank you. Sally lent me the dress. Apparently the hotel keeps a supply for emergencies. An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy companionship they had shared in the cabin. There, they had been simply two people, isolated from the world's expectations and judgments. Here, in town, reality reasserted itself, bringing with it a host of complications. "I spoke with the sheriff about the wolves," Quincy said finally. "He'll alert the ranchers in the area to be on the lookout, and I've restocked my supplies, so I'm ready to head back." "I see," Josephine said, unable to keep a note of disappointment from her voice. "When will you, that is, do you come to town often?" "Every few weeks, usually," Quincy replied, "more often in good weather." He hesitated, then added, "But I could make a special trip sooner, if you'd like, to check on how you're settling in." Hope stirred in Josephine's heart. "I'd like that very much." Quincy nodded, his expression softening. "I've arranged with Tom Wheeler to meet you tomorrow morning. He'll take you out to your aunt's property, show you the boundaries and such. He's a good man, honest. You can trust him." "Thank you for that," Josephine said. "For everything." Another pause, laden with things unsaid. Then Quincy reached into his pocket and withdrew a small carved wooden figure, a horse, expertly crafted down to the smallest detail. "I made this," he said, holding it out to her. "Last night, after you fell asleep. It's Whisper. Thought you might like something to remember her by." Josephine took the carving, turning it over in her hands, touched beyond words by the gesture. "It's beautiful, Quincy. Thank you." "Just a small token," he said dismissively, though his eyes betrayed his pleasure at her reaction. "Something to remind you of your adventure." "As if I could forget," Josephine murmured, her eyes meeting his. Quincy's expression grew serious. "Josephine, what I said last night about proceeding carefully, I meant it. But I also meant what I said about caring for you." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "I'll be thinking of you, every day." "And I of you," Josephine replied, her heart full. Gently, reverently, Quincy took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Until we meet again, Miss Jameson." And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Josephine standing in the doorway with the carved horse clutched in her hand, and a curious mixture of sadness and anticipation in her heart. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Josephine. Her aunt's cabin, situated on a gentle rise overlooking a small creek that fed into the larger Whitefish Creek, was indeed small but sound, as the lawyer's letter had described. A single room with a stone fireplace. It was sparsely furnished but solidly built, with a small stable attached and a garden plot that, though currently fallow, promised fertility come spring. Tom Wheeler, the lawyer, was a slight bespectacled man with a meticulous manner that belied his frontier setting. He showed Josephine the boundaries of her property, 5 acres in all, and explained that her aunt had left a modest sum in the town bank as well, enough to see Josephine through until she established herself. Miss Elizabeth was quite specific in her will, Wheeler explained as they stood outside the cabin. The property was to go to her niece, Josephine Jameson, and to no one else. She seemed quite confident you would make good use of it. "I barely knew her," Josephine admitted. "She and my father quarreled years ago, and I only met her once when I was very young. I remember her as being very tall and wearing a man's hat." Wheeler chuckled. "That sounds like Miss Elizabeth. She was unconventional but respected. Taught at the school for many years, until her health began to fail. Even then she would have children come to her cabin for lessons. She believed in education, especially for girls." "I had no idea," Josephine said, moved by this glimpse into her aunt's life. "Father never spoke of her, except to say she was headstrong and unsuited to proper society." "A fair assessment from a certain perspective," Wheeler acknowledged with a smile. "She certainly had no patience for what she called the constraints of Eastern sensibilities. But she was a good woman, fair and kind when it mattered." Over the next days, Josephine cleaned the cabin thoroughly, airing out bedding that had been stored in cedar chests, scrubbing floors and windows until they gleamed. The townspeople, curious about Elizabeth Jameson's niece, began to call, bringing small gifts: a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of preserves, a bundle of dried herbs for tea. Mrs. Hollister from the hotel sent Sally with a basket of household necessities: soap, candles, matches, and a small sack of coffee. Mother says you're to come to Sunday dinner at the hotel, Sally informed her. She doesn't approve of women living alone, but she says if you're anything like your aunt, there's no talking sense into you, so the least she can do is make sure you're properly fed once a week. Josephine accepted the invitation with grace, grateful for the woman's brusque kindness. Sunday dinner at the hotel became a weekly ritual, introducing her to other townsfolk and helping her establish herself in the community. The town's seamstress, a widow named Martha Simmons, took an immediate liking to Josephine and offered her work helping with alterations and repairs. "I'm not as young as I used to be," Martha explained, her fingers gnarled with arthritis, but still nimble with a needle. "My eyes aren't what they were, and I could use a pair of young hands. Your stitches are neat, and even you've had proper training." "I was apprenticed to a dressmaker in Philadelphia," Josephine confirmed. "After my parents died, it seemed the most practical course." "Well, their loss is our gain," Martha declared. "I've more work than I can handle with the mine bringing in new folks every month. You help me, and I'll see you get a fair wage." Thus Josephine found herself with a steady source of income, supplementing the modest inheritance from her aunt. She worked 3 days a week in Martha's shop in town, spending the remaining time tending to her cabin and preparing the garden for spring planting. Yet, despite the warm welcome from the townspeople and the satisfaction of establishing her independence, Josephine found herself watching the trail from town to the mountains each day, hoping for a glimpse of a familiar rider on a sturdy gelding. 2 weeks after her arrival in Whitefish Creek, her vigilance was rewarded. She was hanging laundry on a line beside the cabin when she spotted a rider approaching, tall and straight-backed on a chestnut horse she recognized immediately as Rusty. Josephine's heart leaped in her chest, and she had to resist the urge to run down the path to meet Quincy. Instead, she continued hanging her laundry, though her hands trembled slightly as she pinned a blouse to the line. Quincy dismounted at the edge of the cleared area around the cabin, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Jameson," he called, a smile breaking across his face. "I see you're settling in." "Mr. Morgan," Josephine replied, unable to keep an answering smile from her lips. What a pleasant surprise. He looked even better than she remembered, the sunlight catching the golden highlights in his brown hair, his blue eyes clear and bright against his tan skin. He'd kept the mustache, but was otherwise clean-shaven, his clothes neat if well worn. "I was in town for supplies," he explained, stopping a respectful distance from where she stood. "Thought I'd check on how you're faring with your aunt's place." "Very well, thank you," Josephine said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Would you like to see what I've done with it, and perhaps stay for some coffee?" "I'd like that," Quincy said, tying Rusty to a nearby post before following Josephine to the cabin. Inside, the transformation was remarkable. The single room had been thoroughly cleaned, with colorful quilts on the bed in the corner, curtains at the windows, and a small collection of books on a shelf beside the fireplace. A rag rug brightened the wooden floor, and wildflowers in a mason jar adorned the table. "You've made it your own," Quincy observed, looking around with appreciation. "It suits you?" "Thank you," Josephine said, pleased by his approval. "It's small, but it feels like home already." She moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee was keeping warm. "Please sit. Tell me how you've been." As she poured coffee into 2 tin cups, Quincy settled at the table, his hat on his knee. "Not much to tell. Spring's coming, so I've been mending fences, preparing for foaling season. 2 of my mares are heavy with foal, due any week now." "How exciting," Josephine said, genuinely interested, as she placed a cup before him and took the seat opposite. "Will you sell the foals?" "If they're strong and show good lines," Quincy replied, "though I might keep one if it has the right temperament for training. Always looking to improve my stock." They talked easily, slipping back into the comfortable rhythm they'd established during her stay at his cabin. Quincy told her about a mountain lion he'd spotted near his property, about the early wildflowers beginning to appear as the snow receded, about plans to add a room to his cabin come summer. In turn, Josephine shared her own news, her work with Martha, her Sunday dinners at the hotel, her efforts to prepare the garden for planting. "Mrs. Wheeler, Tom's wife has promised me some seedlings from her own garden once the danger of frost has passed. Clara Wheeler has the finest vegetable garden in the county," Quincy affirmed. "You couldn't ask for a better gardening mentor." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the soft sounds of the cabin, the tick of the small clock on the mantel, the crackle of the fire in the stove, the distant call of a bird outside the window. "I've thought about you," Quincy said finally, his voice low and sincere. "Every day, just like I said I would." Josephine's heart quickened at his words. "I've thought of you too," she admitted. "Wondered how you were, if the wolves had returned, if you were eating properly without me there to cook." A smile quirked the corner of Quincy's mouth. "My cooking's not as good as yours, but I manage, and no sign of those wolves, thankfully." Another pause, this one charged with unspoken feelings. Quincy's eyes met Josephine's across the table, his gaze warm with an emotion that made her breath catch. "Josephine," he began, then hesitated. "I know we agreed to proceed carefully, to give ourselves time to be sure, and I still think that's wise. But these past weeks being apart from you have only confirmed what I already knew in my heart." "And what is that?" Josephine asked softly, hardly daring to hope. "That what I feel for you isn't just a passing fancy born of unusual circumstances," Quincy said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "It's real, and it's growing stronger every day, despite the distance between us." Joy bloomed in Josephine's chest, bright and warm. "I feel the same way, Quincy. Being here, establishing my own place, has given me perspective, and the perspective I've gained is that I miss you every day, that I think of you with every new thing I experience, wishing you were there to share it with me." Quincy reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm not a wealthy man, Josephine. I can't offer you fine things or an easy life, but I can promise to work hard, to be honest and faithful, to do everything in my power to make you happy, if you'll give me the chance. Are you proposing, Quincy Morgan?" Josephine asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Not yet," he replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "That would be rushing things, even for a foolhardy cowboy like me." His eyes crinkled with humor. "But I am asking if I might court you properly. Call on you when I come to town, take you to social gatherings, let folks know my intentions are honorable." Relief and delight mingled in Josephine's response. "I would like that very much." Quincy's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then may I begin immediately by asking if you do me the honor of accompanying me to the spring social next Saturday? The town holds it every year to celebrate the end of winter. There's music, dancing, food nothing fancy, but it's a good time." "I'd be delighted," Josephine said, returning his smile. "Though I must warn you, my dancing skills are limited to formal ballroom steps. I'm not familiar with Western dances." "I'm a passable teacher," Quincy assured her, his eyes twinkling, "and what I lack in grace, I make up for in enthusiasm." Their laughter filled the small cabin, a joyful sound that seemed to bless the space and promise happiness to come. Quincy stayed until late afternoon, helping Josephine repair a loose shutter and offering advice on the garden plot. When it was time for him to leave, they stood together at the edge of the clearing, reluctant to part. "I'll be back on Saturday," Quincy promised. "Around noon, if that suits you. The social doesn't start until evening, but I thought we might spend some time together before it begins." "I'd like that," Josephine said, looking up at him with undisguised affection. Quincy hesitated, then bent and kissed her cheek, his lips warm against her skin. "Until Saturday, Josephine Jameson." She watched him ride away, her heart full to bursting with happiness and anticipation. The path ahead might not be easy. Life in the Montana Territory seldom was, but with Quincy beside her, Josephine felt ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The spring social exceeded Josephine's expectations. Held in the town's largest building, a combination meeting hall and church, it brought together families from miles around. Everyone dressed in their finest clothes, eager for music, dancing, and socializing after the long winter months. Josephine wore her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. She'd spent the morning washing and styling her hair, pinning it up in a fashionable arrangement with a few soft curls framing her face. When Quincy arrived to escort her, his appreciative gaze as he took in her appearance made all the effort worthwhile. He too had dressed for the occasion in a dark suit that, while not new, was well tailored to his broad shoulders and tall frame. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "I'll be the envy of every man in town tonight." "And I the envy of every woman," Josephine replied, taking his arm with a smile. "You're quite handsome yourself, Quincy Morgan." The social was in full swing when they arrived, the music of fiddles, a banjo, and a piano filling the hall with lively tunes. Tables along one wall held a potluck feast fried chicken, roasts, hams, casseroles, pies, and cakes, contributed by the attendees and overseen by a committee of town matrons. Josephine, still relatively new to the community, was warmly welcomed, especially with Quincy at her side. It seemed everyone knew him and respected him, from the grizzled old miners to the prim school teacher. "Morgan breeds the best horses in the territory," one rancher told Josephine as they filled their plates. "Got an eye for good stock and a way with the difficult ones. My Bessie there?" He nodded toward his wife, who was arranging pies on a table. "Says he could gentle a mountain lion if he set his mind to it." True to his word, Quincy proved to be a patient dance instructor, guiding Josephine through the steps of a Virginia reel and a lively square dance. She stumbled occasionally, laughing at her mistakes, but Quincy never let her fall, his strong hand steady at her waist or clasping her fingers. During a waltz, he held her closer, their bodies moving in perfect harmony to the slower tempo. "You dance beautifully," he murmured near her ear. "I have an excellent partner," Josephine replied, acutely aware of his arm around her waist, the clean scent of soap and pine that clung to him. The admiring glances directed their way from others in the hall. As the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear to everyone present that Quincy Morgan and Josephine Jameson were courting. The way they looked at each other, the attentive manner in which Quincy anticipated Josephine's needs, the light that came into her eyes when she spoke his name, all proclaimed what neither had yet said aloud. "Your young man seems quite taken with you," Martha Simmons observed as she and Josephine stood by the refreshment table, watching Quincy in conversation with the sheriff across the room. "Is it that obvious?" Josephine asked, a blush coloring her cheeks. "To anyone with eyes," Martha confirmed with a chuckle, "and I must say, it's about time someone captured that boy's heart. He's been alone too long since that city girl broke his spirit and left him high and dry." "Sarah?" Josephine murmured, recalling Quincy's brief mention of his former wife. Martha nodded, her expression sobering. "Wasn't ready for frontier life, that one. Wanted the prestige of marrying a handsome cowboy, but none of the hardship that comes with it. Quincy deserves better someone who appreciates the man he is, not some fantasy from a dime novel." Before Josephine could respond, Quincy rejoined them, offering a respectful nod to Martha. "Miss Simmons, might I steal Josephine away for a breath of fresh air? It's gotten quite warm in here." "Of course," Martha said, her eyes twinkling. "Just mind you don't keep her out too long. People will talk." "We'll be on the porch, in full view of anyone who cares to look," Quincy assured her, offering his arm to Josephine. Outside, the night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant in the vast Montana sky. Several couples and small groups were scattered along the porch, seeking respite from the heat and noise inside. Quincy led Josephine to a quiet corner where a bench offered a view of the town's main street, peaceful in the moonlight. They sat together, Josephine grateful for the coolness against her flushed cheeks. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Quincy asked, his voice low. "Very much," Josephine replied sincerely. "Everyone has been so kind, so welcoming." "They're good people by and large," Quincy said. "The kind who stand by their neighbors when times get tough." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the music drifting from inside, watching the occasional passerby on the street below. "I've been thinking," Quincy said finally, turning slightly to face her, "about us, about the future." Josephine's heart quickened at his serious tone. "Oh, my place is about an hour's ride from your cabin," Quincy continued. "Not so far, but not exactly convenient for courting. I was wondering if you might consider, that is, if you'd be open to the idea of me building on your land, adding to your cabin, making it large enough for a family someday." The implication of his words was clear, and Josephine felt a rush of emotion so powerful it momentarily robbed her of speech. "Quincy," she managed finally, "are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you, Josephine Jameson," Quincy declared, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know it's only been a few months since we met, but I'm as certain of my feelings as I've ever been of anything. And if you feel the same way, if you could see a future with me, I'd like to start building it, literally. Joy bubbled up within Josephine, bright and effervescent. I love you too, Quincy Morgan. And yes, I can see a future with you. In fact, I can't imagine my future without you in it. Quincy's smile was radiant in the moonlight. He took her hand, his expression growing serious once more. I'm not asking for an immediate answer about the building. Take some time to consider it. It's a big step. I don't need time, Josephine said confidently. My aunt left me that land for a reason to build a life of my own choosing, and I choose a life with you, Quincy. If you want to add to the cabin, make it our home, I'd be honored. For a moment, Quincy simply gazed at her. Wonder and love mingled in his expression. Then, with a quick glance to ensure they weren't being observed too closely, he leaned in and kissed her a brief but tender meeting of lips that sealed their understanding. There's something else, he said as they parted, reaching into his pocket. I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment. He withdrew a small leather pouch and emptied its contents into his palm. A ring, simple but elegant. A small pearl set in a band of polished silver. It was my mother's, Quincy explained, his voice husky with emotion. My father gave it to her when they decided to leave Kentucky and make a new life in the West. Said the pearl reminded him of her beautiful, rare, and formed through adversity. Josephine's eyes filled with tears as Quincy took her left hand, his gaze steady on hers. I'm not a man of many words, Josephine, but I want you to know that my love for you is as true and lasting as the mountains. If you'll have me, I promise to stand by you through whatever life brings, to cherish and protect you, to build a home and a life worthy of your trust in me. He paused, his thumb caressing the back of her hand. Josephine Jameson, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Josephine whispered, her voice catching on the word. Yes, Quincy Morgan, I will marry you. His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if made for her. Then he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. The moment was interrupted by the opening of the hall doors as several couples spilled out onto the porch, laughing and talking. Quincy and Josephine drew apart slightly, though their clasped hands between them told their own story. Shall we go back inside? Quincy asked, his voice still rough with emotion. Share our news? Josephine nodded, her heart too full for words. Together, they rose and re-entered the hall, where the music had slowed to a gentle waltz. Without speaking, Quincy led Josephine to the dance floor, taking her in his arms with a new confidence, a new sense of rightness. As they moved together to the music, oblivious to the curious glances and knowing smiles around them, Josephine marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate fear of freezing to death in the Montana wilderness to the warmth of love and belonging in Quincy's arms, it was a path she could never have foreseen, but would always be grateful for. The cold that had threatened to claim her life had instead led her to the warmth of a love that would sustain her through all the seasons to come. They were married in late June, when the wildflowers carpeted the meadows and the days were long and golden. The ceremony was held on Josephine's property, soon to be their shared home, with the entire town of Whitefish Creek in attendance. Martha Simmons had insisted on making Josephine's dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple yet elegant. Sally Hollister arranged wildflowers in Josephine's hair, while Mrs. Hollister herself provided a wedding feast that would be talked about for years to come. Quincy, standing tall and proud in a new suit, ordered specially from Helena, watched with undisguised adoration as Josephine walked toward him on Tom Wheeler's arm, the lawyer having offered to give her away in the absence of any male relatives. The preacher, a circuit rider who served several communities in the area, spoke of love and commitment, of building a life together founded on mutual respect and unwavering faith. When Quincy and Josephine exchanged their vows, their voices rang clear and true in the summer air, a promise made before God and community that neither would ever break. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter, the community coming together to launch the newlyweds on their journey with all the goodwill and support they could muster. As the last guest departed, Quincy and Josephine stood hand in hand before their cabin, transformed by Quincy's skilled carpentry into a more spacious home, with a proper bedroom added, and the original space expanded to include a larger kitchen and living area. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morgan," Quincy said softly, lifting Josephine into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "I've been home since the moment I found you," Josephine replied, her arms around his neck, her heart full of love and gratitude for the man who had saved her from the cold and brought such warmth into her life. And later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their wedding night, bodies and souls united in the most intimate expression of their love, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter from the storm, but a haven for her heart that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together. 5 years later, Josephine stood in the doorway of their home, watching as Quincy taught their 4-year-old son, Samuel, to sit astride a gentle pony. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard, a sound that never failed to warm Josephine's heart. Their daughter, Elizabeth, named for the aunt, whose bequest had brought Josephine to Montana and, indirectly, to Quincy, slept peacefully in her cradle inside, not yet a year old, but already showing signs of her mother's determination and her father's gentle strength. The property had flourished under their care. The garden that Josephine had started that first spring now produced abundantly, providing vegetables for their table and extras to trade in town. Quincy had built a proper stable and expanded his horse breeding business, his reputation for quality stock spreading beyond Whitefish Creek to neighboring communities, and even to the Army purchasing agents who came through the territory. Their home had grown as well, with another room added for the children and improvements made to the original structure. It was still modest by Eastern standards, but it was solid and welcoming, filled with love and the small treasures of a life well lived. As Josephine watched, Quincy lifted Samuel from the pony and set him on his shoulders, the boy's small hands gripping his father's hat for balance. They headed toward the house, Quincy pointing out something in the distance that made Samuel clap with excitement. Josephine's heart swelled with love for them both, for Samuel with his father's blue eyes and her own stubborn chin, for Quincy, whose love had only deepened with the passing years, whose strength and tenderness continued to be the foundation upon which their life together was built. When they reached the porch, Quincy set Samuel down with instructions to wash his hands for lunch. As the boy scampered inside, Quincy turned to Josephine, his smile warming his eyes in a way that still made her pulse quicken after all their years together. "What are you thinking about, standing here so quiet?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "About how fortunate I am," Josephine replied, leaning into his embrace. "How close I came to missing all this, you, the children, this life we've made together. If you hadn't found my cabin that night," Quincy began, his arms tightening around her at the memory of how close he'd come to losing her before he even knew her. "But I did," Josephine said, raising her face to his. "And you took me in, lit a fire to warm me, and whispered, 'Stay warm with me.' Little did I know then that you'd be warming my heart for the rest of my life." Quincy kissed her then, a kiss that held all the tenderness of their first embrace and all the passion of their years together. "I love you, Josephine Morgan," he murmured against her lips, "more with each passing day." "And I love you, Quincy Morgan," she replied, her heart full to overflowing. In this life and beyond, hand in hand they entered their home, where their children waited and the fire burned bright against the gathering dusk, a light that would guide them through all the years to come, a warmth that would never fade,